When you picture the Victorian age, what comes to mind? Probably steam trains, maybe those fancy dresses, and a whole lot of, well, very proper behavior. But that's just the surface. Underneath all that, it was a time of just staggering contradictions. An age of incredible progress, for sure, but also of deep, grinding poverty. So today, let's pull back the curtain and really unpack that paradox.
This one phrase, it just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the massive confidence, the sheer scale of Victorian Britain. And listen, this wasn't just some catchy slogan. It was literally true. The British Empire was bigger than it had ever been, a global superpower with a reach that was just unheard of. It was all about projecting this image of unshakable strength to the rest of the world. All right, so let's start with the story of progress. This is the story the Victorians really wanted to tell about themselves. And you can't blame them. This was, without a doubt, an era defined by this relentless push forward, this powerful belief that humanity was on an unstoppable upward climb, and that Britain was leading the charge. Now, you have to remember, Queen Victoria was on the throne for a long time, from 1837 all the way to 1901, and things were not standing still. Politically, it was a time of constant change. You had this whole series of reform acts that step by step widened the right to vote. First, it went to the middle classes who owned property, and then later to many working class men in the cities. So slowly but surely, the whole political landscape was shifting towards a more democratic system.
So what was the fuel in this engine of change? Well, it really came down to one big idea: laissez-faire. This was the economic gospel of the time. The thinking was that the best thing the government could do for the economy was nothing. Just get out of the way. And this hands-off policy completely unleashed free trade and competition, supercharging industrial growth on a scale that nobody had ever seen before.
And wow, the results? They literally changed the world. This wasn't just about building more factories. This was about completely remaking the human experience. All of a sudden, steam engines and trains made huge distances feel small. Iron ships could conquer any ocean. The telegraph meant you could send a message across a continent in a heartbeat. And gaslighting in the cities, well, it basically pushed back the night itself. All of this power, this technological and economic might, it really fueled a very specific way of looking at the world. On one level, building an empire was about protecting all those global trade routes. But it was also driven by this, Dean framed it as a kind of moral duty, this idea of the white man's burden to go out and civilize the world. And it was all backed up by this really aggressive, flag-waving patriotism they called jingoism. Okay, so that's the shiny, impressive side of the coin. But for every triumphant story about progress and empire, there was a whole other story unfolding in the shadows. So now let's flip that coin over and take a look at the deep, deep cracks that were forming in the foundation of this so-called golden age. And here it is, the great paradox in a nutshell. On one side of the street, you have this incredible story of wealth, amazing inventions, and strict moral values. But right next to it, sometimes literally in the next alley over, you had this grim reality of just crushing poverty, filth, and the absolute ruthless greed of capitalism running wild. It was like two different worlds living side by side. So, what happened? What caused this massive divide? Well, that incredible industrial boom acted like a giant magnet. It pulled millions and millions of people out of the countryside and into the cities, all looking for work. And for the very first time in its history, Britain became a country where more people lived in towns and cities than in the countryside. The problem was the cities just weren't ready for this flood of people. This led to the creation of these huge, sprawling slums with living conditions that are, well, they're honestly hard for us to even imagine. We're talking about massive overcrowding, whole families crammed into a single room. The sanitation was appalling, which meant diseases like cholera just ripped through the population. Crime was high, and so were the death rates. This was the hidden price tag on that industrial boom. And the very factories that were pumping out all those technological marvels, they were also places of immense suffering. The working class faced terrible hours, incredibly dangerous machinery, and air so polluted it had disastrous effects on their health. I mean, let's be blunt. The nation's progress was built on the backs and in the lungs of its poorest people. Which brings us to a huge question, right? How could a society that was so proud of its morals and its progress just live with such an obvious, brutal contradiction? Well, the answer is in the psychology of the era, a concept that historians have a name for, the Victorian Compromise. So, what was the Victorian Compromise? In essence, it was a massive society-wide exercise in looking the other way. It was this really strict puritanical code of morals that everyone was supposed to follow. By focusing so intensely on personal morality, on being proper and polite, the middle and upper classes could conveniently ignore the massive social injustices their whole economic system was built on.
And the key to all of this was the idea of respectability. This was the ultimate social currency. Think of it as this weird mix of genuine morality and, well, a whole lot of hypocrisy. What mattered most wasn't always actually being good, it was about appearing good. Keeping up appearances, especially in public, was absolutely everything.
And this whole mindset was held up by a few key pillars. Take philanthropy. It allowed the wealthy to feel like they were doing something about poverty, on a personal, charitable level. It soothed their conscience without them ever having to ask why so many people were poor in the first place. You also had the patriarchal family, with the husband as the absolute authority, seen as this little island of order in a chaotic world. And a fierce patriotism kind of glued it all together. But at the same time, the Victorian mind was a total battleground for new, powerful ideas. On one hand, you had utilitarianism, which argued that what's good is what's most useful for the most people, all based on logic and reason. Then you had this huge wave of evangelicalism, which stressed super strict moral conduct based on a deep religious faith. And then, crashing into both of them, you have Charles Darwin's theories of evolution, introducing this radical new idea of a struggle for survival, which challenged, well, pretty much everything people thought they knew. So where did all of this tension, all this contradiction actually go? Well, it poured onto the page. The greatest art form of the Victorian era, the novel, became the main stage for wrestling with all of the problems of the age. It was the one public space where these uncomfortable truths could finally be talked about. You see, for the first time in history, you had this huge, literate middle class that was hungry for stories. And they didn't just want fantasy and escapism, they wanted realism. They wanted to read about the world they were actually living in. This created this amazing bond between writers and readers, and it made the novel the most popular and the most socially important art form of its time. And you can actually see the novel changing right alongside the society it was describing. Early on, you have writers like the great Charles Dickens, who basically invented the social problem novel to shine a light on the suffering of the poor. Then, in the middle of the era, writers like the Bronte sisters started looking inward, exploring the psychology of their characters. And by the end, you get a new generation, people like Thomas Hardy and Oscar Wilde, who were launching a full-on attack on Victorian values themselves. These Victorian novelists, they really saw themselves as having a moral responsibility. Their job, as they saw it, was to hold a mirror up to society and show it exactly what it looked like, warts and all. They were there to call out injustice and, frankly, to teach a lesson. That's why they often used what we call an omniscient narrator, a voice that knows everything and can tell the reader exactly what to think is right and wrong. No gray areas here. At the end of the day, you just can't keep that level of contradiction going forever. The clash between the liberal ideas of freedom and democracy that were growing at home and the harsh reality of ruling a massive empire abroad, it just became unsustainable. And that fundamental conflict played a huge role in why the British Empire eventually began to crumble in the 20th century. Which leaves us with a final, really big question, one that's just as relevant today as it was 150 years ago. The Victorian era achieved incredible progress, but it came at a staggering human cost. And it forces us to ask ourselves, is that a necessary trade-off? Can a society really have massive innovation and progress without also creating massive inequality and poverty? It's the paradox the Victorians lived with, and it's one we are absolutely still grappling with today.